Yorgos's diversity is such that you've got another function, I believe, with the orchestra.
This is, I'm going to make another speech, yes, about the German writer at 7:30 at Goethe Institute, but we have some time.
Yeah, you have some time.
Which German writer?
We're okay.
Ingo Schulze.
Oh, okay.
His book Adam and Evelyn. It's today at 7:30 is the presentation of the book. He is coming to Cyprus. He came already. Yeah.
So we've got some time to throw it open for a few questions. I know I've got a couple. Let's see. Anyone from the floor? Right, I'll kick us off then. I wondered, I think this applies to Stavros first, but I think it applies to both of you in some way. And this is probably a terminological problem. Stavros, how can affect, as being necessarily individualistic, promote communalism, and indeed should it?
That's a very interesting question. First of all, we should say something about affect itself, very, very briefly. Affect is a theoretical term that has become very, very fashionable these days. I have embraced it because affect for me becomes that surplus of emotional investment in an artistic object that becomes quite crucial when you discuss issues of being, of identity, of subjectivity. And I've always loved excess. I think it's quite obvious. I think that affect came about as a result of findings of queer theory. In other words, I connected directly to queer theory. And what queer theory has done is try to investigate the silences, the empty spaces. This is what I've also tried to do. I mean, Yorgos has been telling us about Cypriot poets and how they look at, their own versions of their homeland. And what I try to do is I come along and I say, okay, where do we have things that are not spoken about? Where do we have silences? Where do we just have gesturings but nothing referenced? And that's what I like to investigate. And very often I find that the things that require this kind of emotional, the theoretical term is cathexis, emotional investment into something, I find that they help me with my exploration of identity and imagination and so on. Now, in terms of affect becoming a communal feeling, if you like, it's similar to an artist exploring his or her impulses on canvas, and that canvas comes to be displayed, and it becomes a community matter quite suddenly and quite publicly. Is that okay, Paul?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're still dissatisfied, tell me later, because I don't know how much more they want to hear. But tell me later, because I'm interested in this, and I can't say that I've reached the end of my path of exploration. Certainly, I'm exploring it as well, and it's something that, we were saying with Paul earlier that affect has been thrown about quite a lot, and sometimes with these theoretical terms, they get to be abused quite a bit. And often you have to explain how you're using it, how I feel you have to explain how you're using it, how you understand it.
This sort of kicks on to something I'd like to ask to you, Yorgos. Do you feel, because there's Stavros talking about that sort of emotional investment and the emotional excess, this recourse to myth that you see both in the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot, do you see that as constraining or as transformative, to use Stavros' word?
Well, I don't know. I think that it gives a creative impulse in literature, in poetry, the use of myths and associate these myths in connection with the references to historical monuments, cultural monuments. And we are now I believe that we are now in a turning point in Cyprus literature, where memory is becoming more and more important in writing, and also there is a kind of using all these tradition, mythology, culture of the past to find ways of a modern, contemporary unification, to overcome all this separation that existed for so many years. And I insisted that although in everyday life there were connecting points and people knew each other, they could communicate, in written culture, in all types of written culture, there was a complete, separation. People didn't communicate. And if we use the same myths, the same historical traditions to understand what is connecting us through centuries, this is important.
Sorry, Marilyn.
Question. For Mr. Mouleskis, Mr. Karayani talked about this necessity of moving away from master narratives for him and speaking more about the personal narratives. Do you think that the Cypriot poetry, both for Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, moves away from master narratives, or do their personal narratives kind of get subsumed by the master narrative? Do they move away from it, or
Yes.
or
No,
not?
no, what I think is that in contemporary poetry, it is true that poetry moves toward the personal myth, a personal mythology, let's say, a personal understanding of things, a personal conception of history, mythology, and what happened and what is happening. I believe if we go carefully to poetry, we will see that this change, I said, from history to geography, from geography to personal approach.
And also, if I could, because I also read this poetry, I think that sometimes, Marilena, it's a question of negotiating with the master narrative, speaking to it, speaking away from it, and so on. So it's woven in and out sometimes, yeah. And other times I read the poetry of Turkish, Greek Cypriots, and I see that they simply can't get away from it. They're speaking from within it. And that troubles me a little bit, because I want to look for different things. But also, if I could, since I have the floor again, for just very, very quickly, I'm also troubled by often the way that we look at this binary, Greek, Turkish, Cypriot. We also have a Maronite community that writes. We have an Armenian community that writes. We have an international community in Cyprus that writes for many. And I think that if we move away from this polarization a little bit, it might actually might allow us new avenues of understanding Cyprus.
Let me say that if I had 1 hour to speak or 2, I was going to speak about Maronite and Armenian literature
Yes,
as
of
well.
course.
I am somehow connected to Armenian because my wife is Armenian. So, but 15 minutes it was not enough to develop this kind of ideas. But anyway, this is true.
Yes.
So I have a couple of questions down the front, then first and then...
To come back to your point about the references to historic names, I think there are multiple ways one can approach this issue of historic names. I mean, one way to approach it is to see it as an attempt to claim space historically and to claim a space which is politically contested. So the reference to Greek historic names in Cyprus has a nationalist agenda behind it.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you have a shift now to different types of historic names after 1974. A second way to approach the reference to the historic names has a religious dimension. It is the ritual power of the name. The sounding of the name in a sacred space has a purifying effect in religious ideology. So that's perhaps another way of trying to contextualize the attempt of specific poets to sprinkle their poetry with the sound of names, as if they are, sanctifying space for Hellenism.
Yes. As I said, we are in a turning point. Before, the references to historical names had a nationalistic approach. The references to religious names had a kind of religious, also isolating side. But now things are changing. I remember the poetry of my friend, for example, Fikret Demirak. He uses Jesus Christ, Virgin Mary, in a very different way, in a different, with a different meaning. And I think such processes are going on now to bring historical even references down to more contemporary and personal issues. But this is, I think, is something to be studied by young students, or I don't know.
Elizabeth?
I just wanted to sort of sound off of what you were just saying, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, you guys are sort of wordsmiths in a certain way, and one of the wonderful things that, George, you were pointing out a little bit, is that language does, at a certain point, lend itself to complete non-communication, but there's an excitement and a real freshness that's happening a lot, I know, in your community of translation. And so this translation, first of all, it opens up dialogue and a different way of I suppose just a completely different discourse about your own very personal work. But then also to go to this idea of names, there's also a translation of names that has to do with this very personal understanding and experience with the name. I mean, I sometimes really envy people who write, because you have that community happening, that we don't need so much translators with images.
You know, I learned a lot. My last book published in Athens was Contemporary Turkish Cypriot Poets, an attempt to communicate, or for communication.
Απόπειρα επικοινωνίας.
Απόπειρα επικοινωνίας. This is my last book, and I was amazed that it was accepted and published in a good publishing house in Athens. The way I did that is I had an English translation or a rough translation in Greek. But the way was the discussion with the poets themselves, to discuss things. And this was extremely interesting process. For hours we were discussing with Fikret, who didn't know very good English, and he was explaining me his poetry with gestures and movements. Emin knows very well what I mean, with gestures and movements of his body and his hands and expressions of his face. And all this is a kind of, gives you a lot to come in, to understand the other person, to go in his personal feelings and how he conceives the word and everything. Yeah.
It speaks to what I was saying about embodiment also.
Yes, yes.
I think as somebody who's been writing poetry for a long time, performing it, this whole issue of what you represent and who you represent is very, for me, always has been very ambiguous, because performing to different audiences around different countries, I represent different things to them. So one person comes up to me after I read a poem and they say, after I perform a poem, it's not just reading it, I'm really sorry, you know. And I say, what do you mean you're really sorry? Well, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it, you know. And I said, but I don't want your pity. Now that doesn't happen every time. So I don't think it's so much about community, I think it's about communication and how you communicate. And in these processes of communication, there is a lot of exclusivity. Who is included as a poet and who is not included as a poet because of the language they express themselves in. I've experienced more discrimination with my poetry in Cyprus than I experienced in England. Because in England, there's all these kinds of organisations like, say, for instance, Apples and Snakes and the Arts Council and so many things that you can turn to actually promote poetry in a very diverse way, with 15 people doing 15 different languages even. It's a very diverse audiences, and nobody's got a problem with it. Because when you come back to Cyprus, graphics Anglican, oh, you write in English. It's not really poetry then. And I find that very insulting.
And you're not really Kipreos.
Because in that case, then Pablo Neruda is not really poetry, Nazim Hikmet is not really poetry, Yannis Ritsos is not really poetry. Because all these three great poets have been translated in, you know, tens of different languages. And they still work in all those different languages. So I think it's an aesthetic issue as well.
It is.
And it's very difficult to talk on behalf of a community or people or a nation. And I think anybody who thinks they can do that is deluding themselves.
This is something that Mehmet Yashin complains about all the time,
Yeah.
not wanting to be the Turkish Cypriot guy.
Yes.
Mm. Well, I think we'll have to get to call this section to a close, but we're obviously going to be continuing the conversation into the next half. And I'd like to thank very much both Yorgos and Stavros for giving us a great start.